Okay, so this is the brief audio review of Exam 2 for SOC 356. Okay, so for the first one, there, in the reading that talks about different time periods and how it affected, or how the development of the understandings of heterosexuality happened over time, right? So in the early 1800s, you have this early Victorian true love era, and this is when the ideals of true manhood and true womanhood were really cemented into the culture. These kind of rigid gendered expectations of difference, the separate spheres. I don't know why it's so hard to say that. Separate spheres. Argument, right, that men belonged outside of the home, women belonged inside of the home. The expectations of domesticity on behalf of women to raise children, to be inside the domicile, taking care of the house, and really to characterize those values to their children. Of course, this was a very race-based and class-based ideal, as it was completely inachievable to anyone that wasn't extremely wealthy and white. But at the same time, this ideal was really about, and how it related to sexuality was to say that, only heterosexuality was normative and natural, that it was only within the confines of a marriage and for the purposes of procreation that anyone should be engaging in any sexual activity. So it really didn't see, an ideal manhood and ideal womanhood was really about, really not having a sexuality, being asexual, unless that sexuality was just for the purpose of procreation. And so it wasn't really to be an idealized woman or man, it was to be almost sexless, right? To see sexual pleasure as distasteful, as something to be kind of, that's disgusting or beneath someone that's so, fancy, I guess, very at the top of the social ladders. When you get to the late Victorian sex love era, this changes a little bit. This is where you get changes in the economy that were taking place, that were, moving us into the Industrial Revolution, where we're already in it, basically, at that point, where a lot more manufacturing was taking place, so a lot more consumer goods were being produced, instead of people having to make a bunch of stuff in their homes, which, if you're making all of those things and they're a finite resource, they're scarce, so the way that you deal with those objects is very different, right? Because you're worried about saving and providing for the future in a way where if you know that you can just go to the 7-Eleven and pick up 10 more, right, you don't have that same value system. So the fact that we got all these consumer goods, it basically changed the way that people had like this pleasure principle, this idea that they should be able to enjoy things, right? You don't buy an item just because it has a specific utilitarian function for you and that is it, right? Like you're like, these shoes have a certain arch support and that's why I wear them. But also, no, you pick them because you like the way they look, or they have a certain style, or they have a certain connotation to them. So anyway, as we started buying a bunch of crap, we started developing more of a relationship of pleasure with those things, which also kind of spilled over into our understandings of sexuality. So this is when we first get, documented accounts of heterosexual lust, and really just kind of expressing that, sexuality was something to be enjoyed more so than just something that's like, oh, whoops, we have to do that, right? Like it was in the early Victorian true love era, was that like sex is gross and distasteful, but, we need to procreate. But once you get to late Victorian, they're like, hey, actually, this could be enjoyable. Then moving into the hegemony, this is, of course, just meaning that heterosexuality became just really considered the only normative expression, like the healthy expression of a sexuality, and any deviation was really a problem, right? A social problem, because it became a deviant identity, right? And then basically from 1965 onward, we started challenging these things, right? You have the women's movement, which kind of in tandem with a lot of the anti-war movement created this kind of a Venn diagram overlap of the free love movement, right? Which really promoted sex for pleasure, not for procreation, which really challenged a lot of the gender role expectations of sex roles, which really questioned only heterosexuality as being the most normative expression of sexuality. And so since that time period, there's been a lot of movements formed, different groups and identities. Of course, we watched, earlier in the class, we watched Stonewall Uprising that deals with a bit of this, right? How the kind of gay rights movement came out of some of these struggles. And so, yeah, it's just about how we've moved on from some of these more rigid understandings, and now we're trying to question and expand those definitions. All right, moving on to the next one. Unfortunately, there is homophobia within communities of color. So this can be a problem for people that have these identities that overlap. So it sometimes can make people feel like they're at odds, where they have to kind of choose between one community or the other because they don't feel like they can be truly all of their identities at the same time without being marginalized within both groups, really. Dominant media images are important because the media message really affects the way that we perceive people and the way we treat them in real life. And so for many years, homosexuality was completely erased from existence within media. It just wasn't portrayed at all. And then in the early waning years when it was just the worst, basically. The most egregious or banal or just really upsetting stereotypes that could be used that really portrayed people as, or homosexuals as sexual predators and things of this nature. So, or like psychologically ill deviants. So anyway, when the media messages started to change, new stereotypes started to emerge. Like in the 90s, we started getting this only, representation of gay men that we kept seeing over and over and over was a certain kind of, muscled, hyperfemme kind of white, affluent, male representation, as if that was all the queer community. And so that really does skew people's perceptions of people who are actually diverse and real and much more complicated than a stereotype. Exclusion from mainstream. Just the idea that if, we're trying to, have movements that fight for a better representation, that means that you need to be included in the mainstream narrative, that you need to have your reality just be another possible reality instead of being a, deviant or looked down upon, marginalized identity. So the author sees the solution in abolishing masculinity seen in larger society because it's not as if the kind of policing that's going on within these communities is coming from nowhere. It's completely connected to the power structures in the culture and the ways that we really rigidly define masculinity in the culture, which really also constrains, cisgendered and, heterosexual men as well, right? Because of these, pressures and standards. So it's not until we really start expanding those definitions or at least, or even abolishing that really strict standard of masculinity that we're going to have more freedom for people to see each other as people and to basically accept each other as difference. All right, moving into chapter 3. Okay, so, slurs. Basically, slurs are pretty powerful because they reflect broader cultural and political values in the larger society. So, they are not just about calling someone a bad name. It's also about invoking the hierarchy of the power structure to say, like, you're lower on the ladder, right? So one example of this is the changing of the word bitch, right? Where it used to mean a female dog, which is like the original definition, but then it started to mean a woman that just was too strong-willed, that went against the expectation of a woman being submissive, right? Then it changed to just be like, oh, it's just a thing you do when you're mad about something, you bitch, right? You complain about something. And then it became, a word to understand or to label someone as someone you control, someone you dominate, right? And then really nowadays it's even used as almost like a badge of pride. Like people will wear a t-shirt that says bitch, or like there's literally a magazine that's a feminist magazine about pop culture called Bitch. So, you know, just the way that even that term has changed shows how complicated slurs are. Um, Inversion is just the idea that sometimes oppressed groups will take a slur and turn it into, or invert it, and basically turn it into a label that's no longer um, being used as a slur. Ugh, that was a really bad way to put it. So, for example, queer used to be a thing that people would, you know, use as a slur against people in the LGBT, you know, the LGB basically community. And so now it's been reclaimed to be more of an umbrella term for people that don't fit the specific standards of a, you know, specific sexual or gendered expression. Let's see, gendered language. So language is important because it's how we communicate, it's how we express our meanings, so it structures our understandings in a lot of ways. So a lot of the ways that we do this in our culture is we'll use the word like man to represent everybody. I'm really bad at this. I'll always be like, okay, you guys, right? Things like that. But it's only weird when you flip it around because then people get offended, right? So if you're like, okay, ladies, and like someone in there isn't a lady, they get offended. Why? Because it's literally a thing that's used often in masculine culture to degrade men, right? Like if someone calls you a lady, or they call the group lady, like the coach is like, all right, ladies. He's doing it to be purposefully, you know, calling upon that power structure in society to try and make someone feel like they've been, you know, not meeting up to an expectation. So then it just becomes almost like a knee jerk to always kind of go with calling, you know, if you call a woman a guy, she's not as offended as if you call a guy a girl, right? Because why? You're challenging that invisible power hierarchy. So again, a lot of times when it comes to the ways that we label stuff, we have to differentiate through gender, right? Like there's a lot of people now that are actors that are really just saying, you know, I want to be called an actor. I don't want to be called an actress, right? Because this ESS is basically like a cuter, littler version is what that kind of means, the ESS. So, you know, you have like hostess or stewardess, you know what I mean? Waitress, like all of these things. Instead of just having a name like, actor, it's actress. It's just to kind of remind you that not only is this person different, but that the difference is lower in the social hierarchy, right? So the gendered language really does this a lot of times. And of course, we talked about too how the way that we have segregated jobs, and we expect those things to be segregated, so we often qualify with words when people are in industries that we feel like there are not normative to them. So we'll say like, oh, he's a male nurse, or she's a female pilot, or things like that. And really often, even the way, even words like what it means to father somebody, like you are the father, right, on Maury, is very different than like mother. Like, oh, she's so mothering. Doesn't necessarily mean like she pushed you out of her vagina. It actually means more so that she's caring and tender and attentive, which is more, you know, again, just kind of associating mothering with actually taking care of children versus associating fathering with like procreation, right? So it's just interesting how the language itself can reflect some of our value systems, but kind of subtly that we often don't notice it. It's the same thing when it comes to ethno-racial language, right? The way we say black and white, as black being, you know, bad and white being good. So we'll say like, oh, there's just a little white lie. Or like, oh, he's the black sheep, right? We have a lot of these ways that we really subtly always bring up how white is considered, you know, good, and subtly we're promoting this kind of white supremacist notions of, you know, white being purity, right? These kind of things. And, you know, dark being bad. So those things kind of soak into us as we're growing, and it affects our, you know, understandings. And then also it can be coded, right? Meaning it can be not direct, but meaning something that is like a dog whistle to somebody that says to them, oh, this means that group, right? So using like law and order has been a thing of that for many, many years. But coded language could also just be, like in the 80s, they did this very famously. In the early 90s, the welfare queens, right? 80s, early 90s, this idea of this woman who would just have a bunch of kids and be on welfare. When people would picture it in their mind, there's a very racialized notion of who a welfare queen was. Or nowadays when we have, Black Lives Matter protests as a result of the police killing unarmed people of color, and at the protest, the way that they'll be reported in the media, they'll say, oh, these thugs, these hoodlums out here, right? There's a very racialized understanding of words like that. So nowadays we have a lot more coded language where people try to act like they're not saying something racially offensive, but they are. When it comes to sexual language, after the word heterosexual exists, we get the word homosexual, also coming from medical, documents. And so as this word now existed, then people were able to label themselves. People were able to develop kind of sexual categories and understandings that didn't exist before there was even a word to make a label around. And so this became the opportunity to develop identities, right? So we see this nowadays too as more kind of diversity of understandings of sexual identities come about. We see more expressions of it. Like nowadays, we talk about the idea of being, the kind of like romantic versus sexual. So, for example, someone may be asexual, but they may be homoromantic, meaning that they like to have romantic relationships with someone of the opposite sex, but they, are asexual. Or someone who's like panromantic, that they would want to have relationships with someone who's either male, female, or, trans, or, just basically, instead of it being the kind of understanding of bisexuality previously, you're also incorporating groups of people that are either non-binary, transgendered, etc. So as we develop more sexual labels, we have more opportunities for people to find their identities within these things and create communities. All right, political correctness. I know everyone like cringes when you hear that word because it's such a weird, what they call culture war kind of, trigger word. But we watched that video about the controversy about the team name of the Redskins, right, and how it's considered a racial slur. It has a very specific racial history, but oftentimes as a culture, we don't respect those that are the most marginal and listen to them about what kind of representations really hurt their communities. And so, this problem is that without acknowledging the reality that turning, chiefs into mascots and doing all of these things while at the same time we completely ignore and whitewash the story of, colonization and genocide and murder that happened on this continent. And there's still people living in dire poverty on reservations and now trying to protect the very water supplies that they rely on and these kind of things. It's just frustrating to have people in the culture saying, oh, but why can't I say that word? Or why can't we do a chopping motion, during the sports break or whatever it is. It's just, it's an interesting time period that we're in, where you have some groups of people very clearly stating, like, the logical reasons why these things are offensive. And others that see it as, well, what? That's so politically correct. Now I can't even say redskin. You're like, well, why do you want to? But anyway, gender is another issue in the media. Obviously, we watched a clip about this, about how, Gene Kilborn, we watched that one about media and how representations in advertisements tend to, decompartmentalize women, demean them, and objectify them, and how it really sends the message to all women, and especially young women, that all that matters about you is how you look. So, this means that the beauty standard itself is very exclusionary and very narrow, and especially for women of color, there's very few opportunities to actually be considered beautiful in that standard. And she argues, which I think is so true, that it's profoundly anti-erotic because these messages in the media and in advertising really just say that the only people that have a sexuality are the perfect, airbrushed, perfect, photoshopped young people in those representations. So it makes everyone else feel bad about their bodies, about, how they look, so that they feel less sexual. They feel, more conflict and less, self-esteem, which, obviously the self-esteem gives you comfort in a situation of sexuality where, feeling bad about your body would not. And then, of course, the way that men are represented in the media through that Jackson Katz video that we watched, right? That this tends to reinforce stereotypical gender norms and encourage men to be violent and hide their emotions. And so the normalization of violence is really tied to the presentations of masculinity in the culture that says that, don't let anyone disrespect you, don't let anyone take your power away. If they do, use violence to get it back. And so, he really connects some of these high-profile mass shootings and other, issues of violence with the representations of masculinity in the culture that have a very narrow way for men to express themselves. When it comes to those race representations, there's obviously a big problem with how these representations look, because as they've been used for many years as a way to drive wedges between communities to reinforce white supremacy, that it's important that representations be positive, diverse, and actually, reflect the community, because people judge real people in life based on these fake representations in the media. All right, chapter 6. So global inequalities, there's a lot of this, right, in the chapter. There's quite a bit. So first off is the fact that wealthy nations like to have more power, and so they keep that power by dominating poorer nations, often through financial pressure or, trade exchanges, meaning if they have a treaty of some sort of trade deal, they can often set the prices on goods so that they can, benefit themselves. And often they even, with some poor nations, if they want to basically be in the systems or be able to exchange, buy the goods or trade in, the forms that they need to, they often have to agree to huge debt obligations that mean that they are basically locked in and controlled by these much more wealthy, powerful countries. Let's see. So when it comes to U.S. inequalities, the gap between the richest and the poorest in the U.S. has been growing over the last few decades. It's kind of the most pronounced it's been since the Great Depression. So that's definitely something that's a problem. When it comes to the middle class squeeze, the middle class itself has been really shrinking for a lot of years. It's been largely the result of a few factors like the pay rates for people, right? Our wages have been pretty flat since the 1970s. And as a result, a lot more of the money, the take-home money, is going to corporate profits than ever before, to the top people in the income distribution. So the middle class has actually been shrinking quite a bit because, first people went into like the dual incomes to say, okay, both people in a couple will work, but then when that was not financially enough, people started going into debt, and now people just really cannot sustainably be in the middle class because there's less job opportunities at a high rate of pay. Homelessness. A lot of the issues and causes of homelessness are the same things that are just in the larger culture that really affect everybody, like those stagnating wages, the fact that the cost of housing is incredibly expensive, and then of course in the 1990s, we put in changes to the welfare programs based on this myth that there's like these, it's just those ideologies, right? The ones that say that the poor are just, they choose to be poor and they're just garbage people, and that's why they're poor. And so those kind of things motivated changes to social services and the welfare structure that put, lifetime limits at a pretty low level on a lot of these services, which basically made it so that, people were left without the safety net. And then they end up on the street. Poverty's border, that just means that there's a lot of people that they might not qualify for federal assistance because of the specific poverty line, but they still are really suffering financially, and they're right on the edge of poverty. And oftentimes, this has to do with the way that we define the poverty line. That really hasn't been adjusted since the 1970s, so it's not accounting for the rising costs of education, healthcare, and all sorts of other factors like housing. The gender wage gap. This is just, something we've been talking about, but it's not just about the difference between what people make. It's also the fact that when you look at the lifespan, this tends to be something that happens gradually over time. So in the beginning, when people are like both in high school, basically, you're teenagers, you make about the same. But as people age, this gets more and more pronounced. And this is especially true for women of color who experience this in more detrimental ways. The triple whammy is just looking at the roles of being a poor, non-white single mother, so that each one of those things, being poor, being non-white, and being a single mother, are all things that affect you negatively in our job market. So that's why it's called a triple whammy. Okay, so the next one there, just how race and class factor in is to immigration, as to, what, we look at the history of immigration. Obviously, this has been like who can pay their way in, and certain countries were literally barred or limited. There were quotas from certain countries for many years so that they couldn't send in many people, versus, coming in from more European countries was opened. So just that. Corporate closet is the idea that a lot of times people hide their sexuality within the corporate work world because it's still not very acceptable to be out of the closet. Affirmative action are just those policies that are put into place to try to balance the scales of past inequality by giving people of color and women more opportunities, whether it's in education or employment, right? Let's see. Separate spheres is just that idea, right, that men were supposed to be outside of the home and women were supposed to be inside of the home, and those were separate spheres. The glass escalator is kind of the opposite of the glass ceiling in a way, right? It refers to the fact that men are often pushed into higher positions, whether they want to or not. So they're often tracked towards like managerial or supervisory positions, often over women who have worked there for a longer period of time. And that's in like female-dominated industries. Let's see. So institutions are considered to be neutral by a lot of people. So people don't think that they themselves are capable of discrimination or prejudice. So if you tell someone like the criminal justice system is racist, they're like, but it's a system, it's not a person, how can it be racist, right? When looking at work and economic transformation, obviously our jobs have changed quite a bit in relation to how much the economy itself has been automated, right? How globalization, offshoring, and outsourcing have come about so that this has really changed the way that we work and the way our economy is structured. So as a result of that as well, are the jobs in the modern labor market are really segregated, right? So they're organized around the lines of class, race, gender, sexuality. Well, not as much sexuality, but definitely race, class, and gender. So there's certain industries that are considered like male industries. So there's certain industries considered female industries, or even, women of color industries, right? That even within gendered female industries, there's still different industries for white women than women of color. Often very specific ethno-racial differences, right? Industries for Asian women versus black women, or things like that. Dual economy is the idea that, there's this two layers of the economy. Either you have a retail job or a low skill, low pay job that doesn't require a degree, or you have a high-skilled, high-paid job that requires a lot of education, and it's just one or the other. So there's a big gap in between. Unconscious bias is the fact that, sometimes just your racialized name on a resume will be less likely to get a job, even if they have the same qualifications as someone with a white-sounding name. So these things can be really an unconscious bias, and this is the example I gave the video where the guy changed his name from Jose on applications to Joe and got a lot more responses, just because the way people would conceptualize a guy named Jose versus Joe has a very racialized understanding, and it affects how much worth they think he would have as an employee. But it shows that it's not like an implicit, like people aren't out there trying to discriminate, but they're still discriminating through this unconscious bias. When it comes to media and pop culture, obviously media tends to represent the interests of the people in the most power. So it tends to, show them in a favorable light while ignoring or showing, people that are farther down the ladder, not the hegemonic people, as negative, right? So the poor, people of color, women, etc., are often characterized more negatively. And, this affects the way we then interpret people in the real world. All workers are exploited through capitalism, but not equally. Yep, that's all you need to know for that one. Let's see. Racial profiling is just, the tactic of, focusing on racial minorities as suspicious or the usual suspects, right? It is illegal in the United States, though it still does happen quite frequently. Sexual harassment has been an issue for a lot of years, but it's still, unfortunately, a problem that's very prolific. So even though everyone has to have training and know about this in every new workplace, there's still very high incidence of sexual harassment. Many complaints reported each year, so it's still an ongoing problem. Feminist sociologists interpret it as, not a way to try to actually date someone, that it's misinterpreted when people think of it as like being sexually interested in someone, when it's really about trying to control somebody, trying to humiliate them or dominate them, or reinforce a position of power over them. And then intimate violence, just according to the World Health Organization, the greatest threat to women around the world, right, is violence in their own homes. And so that's really what I'm asking for there. It's just that that it's so much of an issue across the world that it's literally the most problematic, issue of violence that women face globally is, within their own homes. Alrighty, so hint, when it comes to number one, hint, there is an entire section in the reading about the intersection between poverty, gender, in relation to human trafficking, meaning thinking about who is trafficked, why are they trafficked, how are they duped into trafficking, right? This has a lot to do with those power structures, marginalities, right, of preying upon someone that is vulnerable. And then the wage gap, right? So what is it? Why is it so persistent? Why doesn't it go away, right? Well, there's, the whole reading that deals with how it reinvents itself over time. So as long as you give some of those examples, you're good to go. Hopefully, this is helpful.